Okay, great. Excellent. So I think I will get started then because it is 1 o'clock, 1300, so we want to honor people's time. Hello, and welcome to the first panel presentation of this year's Civil Affairs Symposium, focusing on the role of civil affairs in supporting interagency relationships. My name is Ryan McCannell, and I work for the U.S. Agency for International Development, where I serve as the director of the Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention. My unit is part of a new bureau at USAID devoted to conflict prevention and stabilization. And therefore, we work very closely with our civil affairs brothers and sisters. I also serve as a member of the board of directors of the Civil Affairs Association. Even though I don't have a background in as a civil affairs service member, I'm a true believer in the power of civil affairs as a force for influence in competition, which is the title of this entire symposium. And that's true especially in collaboration with key interagency partners. As we all recognize, the US cannot secure the victory in any sense if our foreign policy agencies are not synced up and capable of achieving unity of effort. In the past, our interagency panel has featured bureaucrats like me talking about various policy processes and strategy documents that set the conditions more or less for interagency collaboration, kind of at the high strategic level. This year, though, in keeping with our theme of putting the spotlight on the future of civil affairs, it's my pleasure to host this panel focused on another set of younger voices and the work that they're doing at the operational and tactical levels to close the gaps and shore up the seams of interagency collaboration. So let me quickly introduce our three panelists whose full bios you can find through the links you use to register for the symposium. And I want to just note we're still working on ensuring we have the appropriate connection for one of the three. So let me note that as we go along. For the folks who are currently on the screen, Ms. Caitlin Conaty, is a Women, Peace and Security Advisor in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy under the DASD for Stability and Humanitarian Affairs at the Pentagon. Prior to joining the DoD, Caitlin was the Acting Deputy Director for the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations Africa Office at the U.S. State Department. And previously at State, she led the teams to counter violent extremism in East Africa and to prevent electoral violence in Nigeria. And that's where she and I worked most closely previously. I will let her explain when she has the chance to do so, her very close connection to the civil affairs community in just a second. Also currently online and visible is Sergeant John Phillips of the U.S. Marine Corps, who is currently a program officer with the State Department's Bureau for Population, Refugees and Migration, where he works on the Asia team. His previous experience includes the Bureau for Conflict and Stabilization Operations, and is also a member of USAID's Office of the Inspector General. He's also served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy as an intern. And as a Marine, he's a civil affairs reservist attached to the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force out of Okinawa, Japan. And I see that Amelia is popping up in multiple capacities here, which is the workaround that we're working on. So let me introduce her real quick. Captain Amelia Fujita is currently a plans officer in Echo Company in the 83rd Civil Affairs Battalion, which deploys civil affairs forces into the Indo-Pacific. She recently returned from a rotation to the Republic of Korea, where she worked with the 8th Army Civil Affairs Directorate as the Civil Information Management Chief. Amelia was previously regionally focused on West and Central Africa, serving as the Special Operations Command Africa Liaison. There she is, hello. To the USAID West Africa Regional Mission in 2018. So she's still getting herself set there. Can we hear you? Can we hear you? Okay, we're still working on the sound, but we at least see you, so that's good. Okay, excellent. So the way that we decided to run this particular panel is I'm going to ask a few questions of each of the panelists, and we'll sort of rotate around and answer those questions while we allow our attendees, who now number more than 50, to consider some of the questions that you may have for our interagency colleagues, and then we'll open it to the Q&A toward the end. So I'm going to start. I think what we'll do from now on is why don't, because so that we can give Amelia a little bit more time, we'll start with Caitlin, and then I'll go to John, and then to Amelia. So hopefully we can just kind of go in order. So let me start with just a very basic question for you, Caitlin, and for all of you, actually. All of you have gone out of your way to select assignments and opportunities that work to bridge the gaps between the civilian and military spheres. So let me start by asking you, Caitlin, what motivated you to work in this space in the first place?
Good question. And thanks again for asking me to be on this panel, and thanks to the Civil Affairs Association for hosting. So to answer your question, I think there are a few reasons, but overall it makes sense, right? To be working in this space and bridging the gaps between the civilian and military spheres, as you said. This was also underscored by my formal education in both my undergraduate and my graduate degrees, my master's degree, and then partly too, so in my work at the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, where I was for just over a decade, the places that we worked abroad were often experiencing instability. So you mentioned that I was the acting deputy director for the Africa office. Africa was where I spent most of my time, or what I spent most of my time on, and in some cases during my time at CSO. And these were areas in which there was naturally, DoD, state, USAID, and other civilian agencies working in this space. It was necessary for us to be able to work together. We often had overarching goals that we were working toward within the integrated country strategy or the CDCS. And so if we weren't coordinating, it was very possible that we could be working at cross purposes. And then also just in my experience at CSO, so before CSO was the Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization. And this was an office that worked in a very whole of government manner. And that instilled in me a belief that we can do more when we work together. So even though it's now, the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, interagency work is still a pretty significant component of the Bureau's work.
Excellent. Thank you. John, I'm going to ask you the same question because you also have this sort of cross-agency experience. So please go ahead and explain what led you to that.
Yeah, sure. So it's a great question, and I'm sorry to give a lackluster answer. I joined the Marine Corps straight out of high school. I've been a Marine longer than I've been an adult. So coming into the Marine Corps at a very young age, I didn't really understand all the various conflicts we were engaged in. So I sort of made the subject of conflict studies central to my academic and my professional growth in the first several years of my career. And going into my undergrad and graduate school studies, really came to zoom in on the impact of conflict on civilians and the corollary impact of civilians on conflict. And I really focused in on that. 2017, I was pretty privileged and fortunate to intern with OSD policy. Not fancy, I was a fly on the wall, but that really locked it in for me that working at the civil-military intersection was where I wanted to go. Shortly after that, I was also fortunate to get brought into the civil affairs community and have been in ever since. Since I joined civil affairs, it's been really coordinating my two careers, military and civilian, ensuring that they always sort of run in parallel and sort of enrich each other in ways that are both interesting and valuable, all to the longer term purpose of working to the benefit of people who are affected by conflict.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Amelia, want to do a sound check to sort of see? While
Test.
It's good, except you have an echo. So it sounds like you're, maybe Arnell can help behind the scenes on that. But we heard you there for a second.
Amelia, you might just have to mute one of them or turn the volume off on one of your things.
Yeah, I did that.
There you go.
There you go. You're
Oh my
fine. Okay. Hey, Amelia. So just since you were kind of coming off and on, so let me just repeat the question for you, just for your own benefit, and welcome. You've gone out of your way to select assignments that have provided some opportunities to work to bridge the gap between the civilian and military spheres. And so I just wanted to hear a little bit more about what drove you to make some of those career choices.
Right. So first I want to say thank you so much for having me. And really, I want to apologize to the entire audience. And some of the prep calls, Ryan had been joking about having to figure out technology. And I'm embarrassed to say that I'm probably the youngest one on the call and I failed miserably. So moving on now. So actually, it wasn't necessarily the case that I went into this. It was kind of accidental. When I was in the CAQC, I was notified about 2 days before graduation that I'd been selected to serve as the SOC Africa liaison to USAID West Africa Regional Mission, which I know you guys aren't necessarily as familiar with the course here at Bragg, but man, like coming from the course and going into that was extremely overwhelming and very daunting. But after becoming part of the team and seeing just the individuals that I was working alongside and the depth of their knowledge and experience, and really the creativity and autonomy that they had to action these plans was really inspiring to me. And that's kind of the domain, especially since it was countering violent extremism and preventing violent extremism, something that has like deeply interested me and something I hope to continue working in. So I'm gonna hand it back over.
Thank you. And it's encouraging because all three of you, sort of similar to the last panel, have like actual on-the-ground experience with doing this kind of 3D collaboration. And so, again, when we normally talk about this, it's always at the level of kind of like high-level documents and stuff like this, and from 30,000 feet, it becomes very theoretical. So I'm encouraged by the opportunity to dive in a little bit more and to really kind of explore many of the same things that just came out. I don't know how many of you were connected with the last panel, but one of the speakers, Staff Sergeant Blocker, mentioned, I think it was him that mentioned that some of our adversaries do not have the same, those that are in less democratic and sort of more centralized systems do not have the same issues around coordination that we face in the United States. And so for me, the civil affairs, regiment is one of the important ligaments that kind of holds the interagency together. And so from that perspective, I just wanted to ask, based on your experiences, can you provide maybe an example of how, in your experience, civil affairs has helped to achieve unity of effort among the 3Ds in the places that you've worked? And Amelia, just so you're aware, we're gonna, I think, go Caitlin, John, and then you as we answer these questions, okay? So Caitlin, over to you if you're ready to speak.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to provide an example from my experience. So the best example that I can provide is from my experience in Kenya in 2017. So we had set up a program to essentially help the US government do a better job of countering violent extremism in East Africa by improving analysis, ideally that leading to better programs to counter violent extremism, as well as better diplomatic engagement, and ensuring that we were learning from our and others' experiences. So at the embassy, I ran a working group to coordinate on countering violent extremism, and that brought together key country team members, including the CIMC and USAID. So there were multiple times that the CIMC was able to provide helpful updates to aid on the programs that aid had going on out in the field that aid wasn't necessarily able to access on a regular basis. And the CIMSE was able to, be in the same area, check in, and provide updates. And then from my specific perspective, oh, and one other point on that too, we would jointly brief, congressional or staff delegations that would come out, which provided a great, a much better kind of holistic picture of what was going on within the embassy to counter violence, extremism, and what the actual VE environment looked like. So from my perspective, I had a small team that we wanted to conduct an assessment along the Kenyan coast of the impact of violent extremist messaging, understand how people received information, how the actual messages were being received by different communities, and we wanted to make sure that we were able to do this in each of the counties along the coast, including Lamu County, which is the most northern county right on the border with Somalia. However, Lamu was off limits for the embassy for the most part because of security concerns and Al-Shabaab activity in the area. So the CIMSE actually made that leg of the trip possible. They saw value in bringing us up there and making it possible for us to meet with their contacts. So not only did the team provide security and logistics, which of course meant that the folks, the security folks at the embassy were okay with us going up there, but we were also able to talk with community members much easier than if we were to come in cold. So as I said, these were people that they had been talking with, communities that they had been working with, people that they had established good relationships with. And then our presence also helped provide greater legitimacy to the CIMSE in the surrounding communities, in the communities in which they worked. So for my part, that was just kind of the clearest, best example that I could think of for how we were, how civil affairs was able to kind of bring all of us together, and how each one of us was able to mutually benefit by working together.
So can I now ask what your connection is to the civil affairs?
Sure. So I ended up marrying one of the guys on the CIMSE.
Right. Okay. So that's a happy ending right there. So that's good. Look at that. That's collaboration. Wonderful. All right, John, I'll ask the same question to you, just a solid example from your experience of how civil affairs has helped to achieve that unity of effort.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the great question. The probably best example that I can think of still remains something that I was, again, fly on the wall for while on OSD policy. I'm sharing a report from State OIG that can shed some light on this. But really it's stabilization, and Northeast Syria being a great example of that. The sort of central challenge faced by the interagency in northeastern Syria, sort of during this time period, 2017, 2018, was that the US government civilians couldn't get into country, right? Diplomatic security wouldn't let them go forward. Interagency processes were constraining. And I think it was something like a 13-month period that we just couldn't move a state or USAID civilian into Syria. During that time, DoD was operating and civil affairs was providing information back to the US government. And I think that was a great example of how civil affairs can tangibly and specifically add value to the broader USG conversation, where the rest of us cannot go, when that space is denied to us, and DoD is the furthest group forward. Civil affairs has an opportunity to really, really shape the conversation through knowing what to look for and through knowing who to tell it to, right? Interagency is a big place. We're all figuring out new stuff that's going on in the interagency every other day. So having specialists within DoD on the ground, on the front lines, knowing who needs to know what information is a really, really is a real asset to the interagency, and can be it can shape policy. So, I mean, we can go into like the various ways that works, mechanically, but all things considered, I think for CA adding value, yeah, there we go. Ryan adding in the CivMil coordination team, which is mentioned in this state OIG report. But for ways that CA can add value, it's really sort of observe, report, and provide access to places that we don't have.
Thanks, John. Providing an OIG report to respond. That's great. Awesome. That's your superpower. That's why we invited you. Great. And then Amelia, not sure what's happening, but I think here we are. We're rebooting.
Yeah.
So good. Could you also respond to that same question? Go for it.
Exactly. So my example is almost the opposite of what John was sharing. When I arrived to Accra, it was about 6 months after the Tongo attack. So civil affairs operations really throughout the region were pretty restricted, and it was hard for the teams to get out. And being able to sit there with the regional office, Peace and Governance in Accra, they had programs and they were actually able to continue getting out under chief of mission as opposed to COCOM authorities. So they were going out doing their programs, and the teams were still working with security forces throughout the region, but didn't have the same ability to move throughout. So while the teams were continuing to work CMO with the security forces and build legitimacy in that capacity, the Regional Peace and Governance Office had a program called Partnerships for Peace. So really this is kind of a story of complementary efforts where they were doing partnerships for peace with local leaders and civil society organizations and such. And by USAID addressing that and CA continuing to work with the security forces, they were kind of jointly able to tackle some of the grievances from those more vulnerable populations in the peripheral areas.
All right, terrific. Excellent. Those are all really great examples, and thank you very much for sort of mentioning those as starting points for sort of a larger conversation. Nevertheless, it's not all sweetness and light when the three agencies with very different cultures come and try to work together, even civil affairs, which we consider to be the closest tribe, I guess, within the US military to what USAID does. Sometimes there are missing links there. And then of course, there's always the interagency scrum at any level. I think it works better at the country team level than it probably does anywhere else. With that in mind, I wanted to ask what you think are some of the main challenges to coordination, and in particular, sort of as you are understanding that you're talking to a wide array of stakeholders, not just US government, but sort of NGOs, but also sort of, some of the leading or higher echelons as well. Sort of what are your perspectives on the challenges and some of the persistent things that you see that have gotten in the way, or even just kind of, random things that should not be, challenges. Over to you, Caitlin.
All right, so for my time on the ground in Kenya, I think we were hampered in our coordination efforts by the short deployment timelines and the kind of loss of information or contacts that came with each team, with each handover. Now I understand, deployment timelines are not really something that we're going to be able to address, but I think that handover can probably be improved by getting teams, when they're stateside, up to speed on the ICS, the CDCS, becoming aware of the programs that are going on in their area of operations, who they need to plug in with at the country team level. I know that a lot of times there are efforts to do academic weeks by bringing teams up to DC to meet with the counterparts at state and aid, which I think is a really wonderful effort. I would love to see that happen more so that by the time the teams hit the ground in country, they're ready to go. They're ready to plug in. They know exactly what the team that came before them was doing, and they can pick up the baton and keep moving as seamlessly as possible. Another challenge that I witnessed is that the teams would have different, focus areas as they got on the ground, and different levels of comfort in dealing with embassy personnel. So I think a way to deal with this is to get people comfortable talking with others in the country team. So, learn how to talk to an ambassador or DCM, right? Learn how the, political section works, or USAID, or some of those other kind of keynotes within the embassy. Again, to facilitate better coordination, and also recognize too that others in the embassy might not necessarily know how best to work with the civil affairs team, with the CIMC, and so you want to make it easy for them to identify ways that you can be helpful to them, helpful to the overall mission, and ways that you guys can complement each other's work. And also just know too that people in the political section and at USAID and in other sections, they can end up being some of your best allies or advocates within the embassy. I mean, I saw this in my time in Kenya, that, I was located on a long-term TDY in the political section. And so in my position, I was able to carry the message of, the reporting and the information that the CIMC was able to gather, and recommendations that they made, carry those into the meetings that we had with the ambassador and others. So I'd say that I would focus on those two challenges and areas for advice for overcoming the challenges.
So Caitlin, if I could just follow up, because I sort of mashed a bunch of questions together there. I just realized. Okay. But one of the things that I hear from my colleagues at USAID missions, and I assume it's the same is true from the State Department, is that you can sort of be it can be a no-win situation with respect to civil affairs teams that rotate more quickly than our typical Foreign Service officer tours of duty. And so they sort of feel that you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. On the one hand, you can make really great connections with civil affairs officers, and presumably, unless you get engaged to them, the point is those relationships happen by the time that you actually kind of feel that they've matured and, communications are going in both directions. The 6 months tour ends, bogged well, whatever, and then they return, and redeploy. On the other hand, if you just ignore what's going on, by a civil affairs team, then at a minimum, there are some missed opportunities. But at the sort of on the most extreme side, there, like you said at the beginning, there can be some work. They can work at cross purposes if they're not connected with the sort of longer term. Any thoughts on sort of how you, or maybe some actual experience on how you manage that while you were out in the field?
Sure.
Or how you your partner, your colleagues do that. Sorry.
Sure. So I mentioned that we had the working group, the CVE working group at the embassy. So this was a way that there was kind of sustained engagement on this from representatives, by representatives from each of the major kind of country team components. So, public affairs, CIMC, USAID, different parts of USAID. So we met on a regular basis. That information was, communicated through the information that we talked about was communicated through notes. Those were shared widely. And so some of it was the sustained engagement there. The fact that we within my team had a particular interest in engaging with the CIMC because our missions were so complementary in terms of countering violent extremism. So we made it a very particular point to ask questions about, okay, who's the team that's coming next? What is their pre-deployment looking like right now? Are they meeting with anybody from CSO or others at State, anybody at the CT Bureau at State, at USAID? Do we have any other connections with them? And then part of it too was back on the DC side. making connections with the 91st down at Fort Bragg, and trying to ensure that they have the information, they're getting the cables as much as possible, to know, what they're going to be walking into when they land on the ground. But a lot of that is kind of one-off and individual. It's not systematized in any way. And, so it's kind of based on personalities, and as you know, I mean, that varies. And at some point too, I left the embassy as well. And, I know my successor picked up the baton as best as he could. But, as I said, unless it's kind of systematized in some way, you're going to lose some information along the way.
For sure. Excellent. Well, thank you. John, I'm going to turn to you and ask also around some of the challenges to coordination, and then any advice that you might have on overcoming those challenges. So we're combining those two questions.
Yeah, sure. Well, first point of advice is to listen to Caitlin Conaty, because 100% agree with everything Caitlin is saying. One of the things Caitlin really emphasized is that, we as DOD and as CA specifically, we really need to figure out what our embassy country team needs. For every country in the world, there is a country team who leads on policy, even countries where our embassy isn't currently in that country. So embassies in exile, we still need to be coordinating and putting our efforts, lining them up with the broader interagency effort. And that gets me to a couple points, challenges to coordination. One is that for CA, we don't always know how to find out what the interagency needs. And on the flip side of that, the interagency, we don't always know what we want from CA. So CA might show up, say, we're really excited to be here, ready to do something. What do you want us to do? And then the interagency kind of shrugs its shoulders. We don't really know. What do you do? And then it gets to this challenge we have within CA. CA doctrine is really sort of opaque. It doesn't really say what we do across the conflict continuum or at every phase of conflict. And I think that can be rectified, and it can help us in the interagency better understand how to engage CA and how to use CA. And on that, I do want to, come to two specific points. This sort of mutual lack of understanding leads to a lot of duplication. CA folks come out with these great ideas, ways that we can, compete in great power competition, ways that we can influence in sort of phase zero or, in cooperation with our host country partners. And they come up with an idea and they go and do it. And they don't necessarily know that there are, 3 or 4 bureaus in state and USAID already doing that. So if we were coordinating more effectively, we could, make the sum greater than its parts, so to speak. And I think in just about every civil affairs engagement or paper that I've seen, there is somewhere in the interagency, someone already doing what is being suggested. We just don't know about it because the interagency is giant and it's inscrutable. It's really difficult to know what's going on in the interagency, particularly if you don't work in the interagency, right? It's really, really hard to find out. So that's one point. Another point to bear in mind is that the DoD doesn't operate anywhere in the world by itself. The interagency is always involved. Every conflict in the world has an interagency component. We don't engage in conflict without clear policy toward that conflict. So it's really critical that we don't train as if the interagency doesn't have a say. Every single exercise, we should be training interagency coordination. And for civil affairs, interagency coordination looks very different depending on where we are in the conflict continuum or at which phase of conflict, depending on which operational construct you're using. If you're using JP 3-0, the operational phasing model, phase 0 through 5, that ends and enable civil authority, stabilize, dominate all those phases. Each one of those, civil affairs has an interagency coordination role, and it changes throughout conflict and it changes throughout time. So it's really interesting and difficult to wrap your arms around what all those various tasks and mission essential tasks those are. So I would underline those two, and then I would say for CA, a clear challenge to coordinating well as I alluded to, it's difficult to know what's going on in the interagency, particularly if you don't have any experience in the interagency. One clear recommendation that I would make is that for CA to reconstitute or perhaps, gobble up some of those interagency fellowship spots. It seems like every year USAID and state gets a whole group of new majors and lieutenant colonels coming in for 1-year assignments with a particular bureau, which is great. I've met a bunch of helicopter pilots and artillery officers and communications officers, and at the end of their year, they go back to being helicopter pilots, artillery officers, or communications officers, rather than coming back to the civ mil community and enhancing the civ mil community with the amount of experience and knowledge that they gain over the course of that year. So I don't know who is in charge of that program, but if somebody can, identify some of those key billets and sort of class them for civil military or civil affairs professionals, I think that would be a great opportunity to strengthen those interagency coordination pieces systemically and over the long term. I'm rambling, so I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, John. No, that's also mystified me. We get occasionally, nothing, I love my armor officers as well, but sometimes you wonder, like, how did that person get, that particular Army fellowship when, and they're working sort of, on our programs in Malawi or something, or serving in that role at USAID, whereas the links to civil affairs are a little bit more obvious. Okay, Amelia, over to you. Same question, challenges and your advice on how to overcome them.
Yep, I think Caitlin and John both hit the nail on the head, and they both stole my 2 talking points, but I can drive on anyway. So kind of piggybacking on what they both said, I think prioritization is a big issue. And I think that's recognized at the top, as we see in the Stabilization Assistance Review, where the 3Ds are prioritized at that level, at the strategic level. And on the ground, we see team leaders that reach out and want to coordinate with the interagency partner in country, and even before. But somewhere in between, between the COCOM and the force provider, priorities shift, and I don't think the interagency relationship is always appreciated at the full value or potential that that exists. Like, it's not always recognized as such. So I think prioritizing that, as the other 2 said, and continuing to seek opportunities and being open-minded, reaching out, because our interagency partners are obviously so experienced that they are able to bring ideas and kind of fact check us on some of the ideas that we do have in the field.
So I'm going to follow up and ask you guys a question that I alluded to when we were chatting the other day about this whole thing, because I think it might be, so I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit because it's not really on our list of questions, pre-approved questions, like the North Korean parliament here. But I just wanted to offer you guys an opportunity to talk about some of the cultural weirdness that happens when you cross from one bureau to, from one agency to another, or work alongside. And because we talked about that. And so, John currently is like serving on a detail to the State Department, but he's a USAID, works for the USAID, but also is a Marine. So he is, I'm sure, like just bouncing around, between all these different cultures. Caitlin obviously, worked for the Department of State. I consider her to be an honorary member of USAID because of the work that she was doing for CSO. And now is working for the Office of the Secretary of Defense, which I'm sure is exactly like USAID. And then Amelia, same thing. Like you came, your background is as a nurse originally, and then you went to CAQC. All of a sudden, you discovered you're being deployed to USAID, which was weird. So can you just talk a little bit about sort of just anything you want about sort of how those different agency cultures kind of, or something that, like in John's case, something that like when you went over to CSO and PRM, which is where you are now, you're like, oh, this makes so much sense now that I've been here. You know what I mean? Like anything that you've seen that sort of opened your eyes to sort of a new way of looking at things, or just something like that. I'm going to let any of you jump in on that because that was completely off the out of nowhere. It does not have to be funny, hilarious. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So I think one of the most shocking things for me going to USAID and sitting in on some of the programming meetings was seeing how much planning on the front end is put into that in terms of like MEL and really establishing baseline studies, studying throughout a program, and then, you know, at the conclusion of it to project which way you want to take a program in the future, as well as budgeting and all of that. Like having that planned out for 3 years, whereas annually we run out of budget, DoD. And like Caitlin was saying earlier, the direction that different team leaders want to take a mission in, or that their commanders give them the guidance for, shifts like so regularly between rotations that the continuity there is really very variable, very different between people. So
Okay.
that was very eye-opening for me.
Anything about storyboards, like the importance of storyboards in civil affairs? No, okay. Just kidding. John or Caitlin, any thoughts on this?
Sure, I can jump in. So there are a couple things that struck me. One, after 11 years at state, I felt like I finally had a good understanding of the different bureaus and offices and roles and positions, only to start at, DoD a few months ago, basically from zero, even though I thought I knew so much more than I did, just because of the sheer size of DoD, the behemoth that is DoD. There are so many different components and just ways that people are operating in this space. It's been a fantastic challenge to try to wrap my head around, and I think I will continue learning on this for a while. And then the other thing is, Amelia mentioned MEL, and I know General Hooper yesterday talked a little bit about assessment, monitoring, and evaluation, and how that has become a much bigger effort within DoD, particularly in the security cooperation realm, since 2017. And it's been, and that's part of my job on women, peace, and security, is on assessment, monitoring, and evaluation. And so one of the first things that I looked for was, okay, where's the equivalent of the F indicators, the foreign assistance indicators, right? A standardized set of indicators that we can measure our progress against. And there's not. The DoD works in very different ways, from both state and aid, which share those indicators, and measure progress in very different ways. So it's been quite a learning experience to again try and wrap my head around how progress is measured within DoD.
John, do you have any last thoughts on this? I see that we've got a few good Q&As knocking on our door here.
Yeah, just maybe a couple points. It is interesting bouncing very swiftly through different offices in state and USAID to see how differently people conceive of their priorities, and what they care about. And going back to the Marine Corps, going back to my very brief time at OSD policy, the importance of communicating your priority in terms of someone else's priority is a really valuable tool. It's a really valuable communication tool for conveying that you're actually working together toward a single objective rather than at cross purposes. So I found, the sort of sort of fiefdoms in, their various priorities to be really fascinating. Language varies a lot. I mean, use of acronyms from one bureau to one bureau and one agency to one agency, really, really difficult. For CA folks, if we can understand, a different bureau's acronyms and translate them into DoD speak, that's massive value add right away. One other point that
Which, by the way, is why I've taken every acronym that you've said and I've tried to plug it into the chat box so that people can follow along.
I noticed that.
Yeah, there you go. See,
yeah.
That's why I'm getting paid so much to host this panel.
Yeah, absolutely. One other point to pick up on Amelia, talking about the length and depth of planning that goes into USAID programming. I also notice a lot more reliance on data. in like state and aid projects, massive amounts of data we collect, and then we cross-reference and we collate. And I think for CA, that's another opportunity for us to really start getting into and being a part of that interagency conversation. Because as we're out in the field, we are creating data. But if we're reporting that data with PowerPoints, PDFs, or Microsoft Word, that data is not machine readable, and we in the interagency can't collate it with our humanitarian data exchange data or our ACLED data or our 3 dozen other data sources. So anyway, just a few thoughts there on various interagency things picking up on over the last few years.
So the last point that you raised responds to one of the questions, partly responds to one of the questions that was raised by Jeremiah Root, one of our attendees, who asked, do any of our interagency partners, state, USAID, et cetera, access or utilize CA products such as SIM, Civil Information Management, Civil Recon, and some of the other work that is done to collect information by civil affairs teams? And I sort of know the standard answer, which is not as much as we should, but I wanted to ask in each of your respective cases, if you're aware, like how you've been able to connect that. I'm kind of tempted to ask Amelia first, because that was probably part of your job out in Accra, so.
Yeah, definitely. Information sharing and facilitating that between SOCAF and USAID West Africa was probably the biggest part of my job. In terms of classified material, not so much, just the cables, but beyond that, the OTI and some of the guys on the Regional Peace and Governance team, the RPGO, monitored PICs somewhat when they were interested in specific region within a country. So sometimes they got some feedback from the teams. Generally though, we weren't sharing storyboards or anything, going back to what you're saying, Ryan. But yes, if information did come out, I shared it with the team and they were able to use that to influence to some extent their operations within the specific country. So
I guess, I don't know if others have anything, but what I'm hearing you say is there's an analog interpretation that's required, right? Like it takes a human being to kind of maybe make that link between one system and another. Is that fair to say? Okay.
I would say that's fair to say. So it definitely takes someone monitoring that as well to make sure that the information is conveyed, because I think, a lot of times we all get so busy in our own like missions or programs that without having someone dedicated to that, some of that does get lost in translation.
For sure. And I see we have another, somebody who's popping up with another question. If you guys, John or Caitlin, have any other quick responses to that, then otherwise we'll ask Melissa to.
I didn't see the new question, or to Jeremiah's question though. I did want to just say quickly.
That's the one. Yeah.
Okay. So far, I haven't seen any SIM products, CA produced products reaching folks I've worked with. My experience is limited, right? But I think the highest level I've seen is in OSD policy. The one-off storyboard gets emailed to someone. But in terms of the State Department bureaus I've been part of thus far and USAID, I haven't really seen CA products making it all the way up. I think that they get stovepiped, somewhere around the combatant command level. But I'm not certain of where they stop. And to Amelia's point, I think it's pretty critical for CA to have access to our information as well. One thing about CA, the interagency, we stay in the country, right? If you come in for a 6-month deployment, a 13-month deployment, eventually you leave. But you should definitely plug into the folks who are there for 3 years plus at a time. And if you don't have access to like the last 6 months of cable traffic or something to build your awareness of what's going on in the civil environment, that's a huge gap that should be filled.
Okay. Just to briefly add, I'd say at the embassy level, we saw the storyboards occasionally, but beyond that, didn't see any other products, and not at the DC level.
So Melissa, are you able to join us and ask your question? I see it in the Q&A box here,
Sure.
having to do with coordination around big data. So it's part of the conversation we're already having. If not,
Yeah, it definitely is. Thanks,
Hi.
everyone,
welcome.
for unmuting. Thank you. It's good to see everybody virtually. So my question, in a lot of ways, is really almost just a rider on what everyone else was just saying. But I was specifically asking. So I work for Motive International. We know most of you, or Morgan knows you, or I know everybody. So we train CA and interagency all the time at exercise and courses. And one of the questions that, or one of the pain points beyond just the pure big questions of interagency coordination, something that we see is just not being leveraged is all of the different organizations in the interagency that are processing big data, that are doing data science for not explicitly CA purposes or not explicitly DoD purposes, but that would be so useful to CA, whether that's what's happening with State Department's Global Engagement Center, or whether that's the Department of Commerce, doing SEO optimization on US websites, or the full spectrum of things in between. What tends to get asked of me personally is, in our organization, I represent sort of the intelligence community, and that's where I come from, my own background. And so what I see happening a lot is the inclination amongst the CA teams and personnel that we work with is that they will ask a question of the intelligence community and not always necessarily get a satisfactory answer. And then they're operating in the dark when there is somebody else in the interagency working totally in the open source realm that probably has that answer. But what I really struggle with is to even tell them, like, this is where you turn. How do you do the equivalent of that RFI for that kind of big data within the interagency, and what experiences have our various panelists have had where it's like, hey, did it ever occur to you that these people are doing some great data science, or they have access to some great partnerships that would also benefit CA?
Anyone? I have some thoughts on this, but okay, while you guys think about it, let me just tell you a couple of quick things. For my office, as I mentioned along the way, and I know I'm not a panelist, but I'll jump in.
Please do.
We have this Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention, and we work for a bureau that's called Conflict Prevention and Stabilization, right? So there's prevention in there twice.
Mm-hmm.
What on earth does that actually mean from an agency that tries to align its ways and means with the end of prevention? And so in order to do that, we really need to look at patterns. We need to look at trends, and we are undergoing right now an effort. We've hired 2 data scientists on our team of about 30 people. We're working pretty closely with CSO because state CSO also has a pretty robust data and analytics capability. I have to say, there are a couple of challenges I would point out. One is around scope, okay? So there are a lot of open source indices that compare, this country to that country, and, and rank countries according to how stable or unstable they are and stuff like that. And many of them are great. They tell a slightly different slice of the story. That's okay for policymakers in terms of how many dollars do we put in Burkina Faso versus, Chad this year. But it doesn't really help on the ground with our colleagues who are serving at, a country team level or a tactical level. And we're not able as a DC-based organization, obviously, to do that kind of deep dive. I think, however, some of our offices that are more expeditionary, and of course our missions, which is USAID's term for our offices abroad, are occasionally able to do that kind of analysis. It kind of gets into I think there's a couple of challenges for that. And they both kind of have to do with the interagency culture stuff and language stuff. So for us, the term assessment, we in state and USAID use assessment as a forward-looking thing and an evaluation as a backward-looking thing. So we assess the operational environment. That's the same way that the DoD uses it. But we always are doing it proactively to sort of determine what our programming should be. It's the first step, whereas an evaluation is usually the last step or the next to the last step when it comes to evaluation, and then what do we learn from that. When we talk about assessments, we're often looking at qualitative data around, that is basically similar to kind of civil reconnaissance in a way. We don't use that term, but it has to do with that. It's key leader engagements that we're doing. We're gathering information. We're out generally in the population we wish to influence with our development assistance, and gathering information and then trying to bring that back to our mission or to our headquarters and determine how to align our resources that way. One other I think factor is that our three agencies and of course the IC all have very different mandates and different uses of information and different descriptions of what they're doing with that information. And at USAID, I think because we're a civilian agency that is really focused on poverty alleviation and all of these kinds of, even though we're part of the national security realm, we are also very focused on the host nation's own capacity and things like that. There's a real, I think, cultural concern is what I would put it, with how information gets shared and what the boundaries are between intelligence and civil reconnaissance, and then like an assessment that we would do, and all the different gradations of that. So I think because of the way that civil reconnaissance is sort of, it fits into one of those gray areas that people in our system don't really know what to do with it in terms of, particularly when we're asked to contribute to it. Because when we'll often have, go out and visit a group of villages in a particular area and then come back with all this great information about what's going on out there, and a hesitancy to share that with their colleagues in the IC or with the DoD because you never know how it's going to get used. You know what I mean? So that's one of the things that I think we all understand theoretically. It's great to share information, but in real life, our agencies do different things with that information, and that exposes, that becomes a very complicated set of issues. Okay, I've talked a lot. You guys should all have something to say now because I just filled all that airtime. Anybody? I see Amelia recharging, so
Yeah.
here she comes. All right.
Okay. So specifically where teams or CA elements are reaching out for that information, I've seen that once, and that was with the commander of the RSIMC, the regional SIMC, who is there when I first got to Accra. And I believe the only reason he really knew to do so was that OTI was conducting a survey in the Liptako Gorma region in Mali, or tri-border region with Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger.
Yep.
And this commander knew to kind of ask questions or see like what level of influence they could have in terms of kind of getting atmospherics or not intelligence, but just information about the civil military relationships in that region. And it was kind of a one-off because that commander had the SOCAF LNO position previously, so he knew like how to engage and how to ask those questions and how to push the envelope in that sense. But to go back to what Ryan was saying about how sensitive information can be, there were several meetings that I got to take part in that were contract sensitive. So obviously I couldn't go back to SOCAF and share that information because that would be very damaging to the relationship that I had fostered there with the office. So that really is a complicated issue, and I don't know that there's an easy answer to kind of bridge that gap.
But can I ask you, Amelia, did you feel like, wow, okay, I can just go back to my doctrine and get like really good, sort of guidance about what I can share and not share? Or was it entirely up to you to sort of, in your kind of gut, about what was appropriate to share and what was not?
So there were some meetings where they very explicitly said, because I think they had some issues in the past where LNOs had shared information that they weren't supposed to,
Okay.
which had obviously caused some fallout and hurt feelings. So some of that was explicitly said, but in other instances, it was my gut feeling and, trying to divine what would really be useful to the teams on the ground, but not breach the trust with the individuals that I was sitting with on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, thank you.
Amelia, would you say, it's so interesting to me because what both of you have just said in so many ways could be the exact experience of like sitting at a national intelligence agency and being asked the same thing, where it's like, yeah, we know things, but we can't just tell you everything we know, series of sensitive reasons why. And so when students ask me that question, when they're like, well, how do we best coordinate? I'm like, go through your chain of command, end of discussion, and it gets dicey. And that's not, for me, it's like, I know that's not helping. It's not helping you for me to tell you that, but the intelligence community is weird that way. It is what it is. But I guess like one of the things that I tell students that I feel is good advice when dealing with the IC, and I'm curious if this advice carries, is I always tell them, listen, you need to be as expansive and detailed with your information requirement and what you intend to do with it, and give as much information as you can about what your indicators are in your RFI. Push that information to the IC so that they understand what you're doing, because they're not going to tell you what they're doing. But if they understand what you're doing, they might be able to get you a better answer than if it's just another thing that comes across their desk. And for me, having been on the other side of that, intelligence operators are real people too. Like, if I have an interest in your mission, I can try to help. But do you feel as though within your roles and agencies that you would have that same kind of latitude, or that would be helpful advice? Or is there another approach that you have seen come out of CA or come out of somebody seeking civil reconnaissance that you're like, oh yeah, we were way more open with them after they approached us with XYZ?
Okay, so I'm gonna just invite a real quick response from folks if you have it, because we do have some other questions I want to ask, and we could go down the information sharing rabbit hole really quickly or deeply. So, any other thoughts on that? There's kind of a dense question, John.
Yeah, super dense question. I would just say it kind of goes back to that earlier conversation about different bureaus and agencies and their sort of institutional culture. Information sharing, different groups are pretty mercurial with their information. A lot of DoD is really bad about this, and I find even CA at times is like, oh no, we need to keep our information to ourselves and not tell anyone what we're doing. And I think within the USG, that's something we really have to fight to overcome. Unfortunately, I know on the interagency side, it's also pretty, it's all over the place. People don't want to share information because, oh no, that's my contracted partner and only I should get that information. So there's a lot of hesitancy. And I don't know what a good answer is on how to overcome that unless it's systematized information sharing. And that's what I would advocate for CA to be doing, particularly because a lot of CA information is sort of by its very nature unclassified. And I would say, share it with your first point of contact on the interagency side. So if you're working at an embassy, get with your Office of Defense Cooperation, your attaché, and find the relevant POL officer and just start sending them information. And eventually information will start coming back the other direction as well. I don't know if that gets specifically to your question, but I hope it helps.
Caitlin, any other thoughts on this? You must have shared information. No, you don't have any answer. Okay, she has nothing.
I think you guys have covered it pretty well.
All right, so let's turn it over to Lieutenant Colonel Garcia with your question, sir. Thank you for your patience.
Good morning. I'm trying to activate my video here. So my question is in regards to access. I know there's a lot of countries that when you're trying to get access, we're trying to get in placement or have ability to communicate or work within a space that is being closed off to the interagency or DOD, DOS, or whoever it may be. But now access in a COVID-19 environment kind of changes, it changes everything. So now we're looking at trying to get access to a place where the government is saying, well, nobody can come in. So my question is, what is the interagency's view and perspective on access within the COVID environment? Is it an absolute restriction, or is it a challenge that the interagency is trying to overcome by trying to partner with these nations and maybe assist them with any kind of problem? That's my question. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so COVID-19 related question on access. I have a couple of thoughts from my perspective, but I want to see if any of the rest of you, if you have any immediate response, just raise your hand.
Can I just ask a clarification? Access for whom and to where? Where are we trying to access?
Great question, John. So within the Pacific Island countries, we're talking the Carolina Islands, anywhere in the Pacific AOR, there are smaller island countries that only have a few commercial flights during the week outside of a COVID environment. Within a COVID environment, they have shut off commercial travel to everyone, to every country. And so now is our adversary are they already there and using the COVID restriction as an advantage? And so that's kind of like where I was headed with that question.
Okay. Let me throw a couple of things on the table just from USAID's perspective. Obviously, we have a different business model. We do not have, you hear USAID talk a lot about its foreign service officers and civil service officers. We don't have any enlisted, right? Our business model is we purchase our mass. So for us, that's actually has proven to be a fairly resilient way of dealing with COVID, in that in places where we have local partners, which is to say, and this is, I'm speaking, I think there's two types of risk to access, or two potential barriers. One is the health, the actual human, sort of development or health aspect. And we've been able to work with our partners locally to go into those areas where we cannot because of health concerns. Obviously, nobody is immune from the virus, but local communities are better able to sort of handle that kind of outreach in their own local systems. We've had to rely a lot on sort of third-party monitoring and some other sort of creative ways of ensuring that the money that we have, the resources that we have for development, go to their intended purposes. But we have relied very heavily on our partner base for that. When it comes to the access that is sort of more of kind of legal or political access, I think that all I would say is that USAID, for its part, has recognized, and this is true with the State Department as well, that these issues become issues of sort of democracy and governance issues, and that a lot of the more autocratic regimes in the world, and those that are aligned or allied to them, are using COVID as an excuse to clamp down on the role of civil society, non-governmental organizations, and to to basically shut down methods for people to communicate with one another and organize and do all the things that they would normally do, in working to create political change. And so we have a whole line of effort in our agency that's focused on promoting democracy and governance as part of our aid programming. And it has become aligned and tied very closely in the last year or two with the great power competition elements that you're talking about, and more specifically, how COVID is being instrumentalized for that purpose. So COVID is almost incidental to this larger kind of effort that's underway. So just from, you know, sort of a broad brush, that's the way that USAID is looking at it right now. We have a lot of resources going to that. And we've used a lot of the supplemental funds that we've gotten for our COVID response to look precisely at those issues of access and governance. Is there anything anybody else wants to say? I think most of you have not been on the ground during this period, so it may be a little bit hard to telegraph a response, but you know, John, you know the region really well. I don't know if you have them, and so obviously does Amelia, so. Or at least Indo-PACOM is your, as you can tell, that's not my region.
So I can't speak to any like DoD or, you know, broader USG access questions. I can talk specifically about humanitarian access, which is a, you know, its own dissertation in its own right. I mean, COVID has been a useful information tool for autocratic regimes to curtail access of human rights groups and for humanitarian organizations providing relief to affected civilian populations in Southeast Asia in particular, but, you know, also across the Middle East and I think to a certain extent in Africa. But I'm not sure that's entirely what you're getting at. You know, that might be an interesting separate conversation though.
Sure.
Thank you, John.
I would just say, I mean, kind of piggybacking on what Ryan was saying, you know, obviously I have not been at CSO since COVID hit. So, and have obviously not been, you know, I've not been on the ground anywhere since COVID hit. So don't have too much to add on that point, but I will just say that, you know, from my time at CSO, you know, access was always something that we considered and tried to, you know, as Ryan said, be creative about, right? So we saw it as being incredibly necessary to be able to ground truth the assumptions that we had, you know, you know, that formed the foundation for the programs or diplomatic approaches that we took. And being able to get out beyond the, you know, the embassy is a really big part of that, of being able to conduct assessments and talk to people on the ground. But, you know, that's not always possible, you know, even just for security reasons. So in a COVID environment, I imagine that folks are also trying to be creative in the sense of trying to tap into, you know, say implementers who are working in the area, or contacts, you know, embassy contacts that they've had for a number of years, or referrals. So yeah, just to kind of double tap on what Ryan was saying on being creative there.
Okay. We have another question that is related also to information sharing, but it's on the humanitarian side. And so the State Department maintains a humanitarian information unit, which basically is a collaborative body. Well, obviously, it provides information to the American people on what we're doing in the humanitarian space. Just for clarity, and the question specifically from Rick, is around are we sharing, like, to what extent are we sharing information with the humanitarian information unit, Rick Meisky. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Let me quickly just say, just to be clear, in the civilian world, humanitarian assistance is a smaller subset of what the DoD represents as humanitarian. For us at USAID, I always say we're the Eskimos. We have 100 words for snow. And so for us, humanitarian assistance is a basket of our overall foreign assistance that focuses specifically on alleviating suffering and saving lives. So it's that emergency response that we go into when there's an earthquake or, you know, a complex emergency, as opposed to the long-term development assistance that we provide to ensure that girls get the proper level of education to become, you know, productive members of their society, which is a generational kind of assistance. The humanitarian and information unit at the State Department is in charge of coordinating all of our humanitarian efforts and ensuring that the work that we do with the UN agencies that focus on this are relatively well coordinated, and that we are doing it with the data, that we have. On that perspective, from the headquarters perspective, we now, in addition to our conflict prevention and stabilization bureau that I mentioned before, we also have a new bureau for humanitarian assistance, which is now a combination of our Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, which many civil affairs and other military colleagues are familiar with, as the folks that do the JHAWC, the Joint Humanitarian Operations Course, and then Food for Peace, which is the food aid section of that. And it's now combined into this bureau. We feed, obviously, a lot of data into the HIU's work from our side. The other major humanitarian element of the US government on the civilian side is the Bureau for Populations, Refugees, and Migration, which John is sitting with now. And so, yeah, so I think at a headquarters level, we're making sure that our famine early warning system data and all of the data that we get from our various humanitarian assistance activities are going into that. What I can't speak to is what our civil affairs colleagues are contributing to when it comes to providing information about humanitarian, disaster response and things like that. So I perceive that it's actually something usually run through the COCOMs, because it's a multi-faceted response when the DoD gets involved at the invitation, I guess, of often. Any insights on that from any of the places that you guys have served? It may be a little too narrow a question for this particular panel, because none of us, except maybe John, have a lot of experience on that. So, okay, I'm not hearing anybody jumping forward with any new information. So that's probably the best that we can do for you, Rick. Sorry about that. We will leave it there and ask if who is next here. So let me see. Okay, sorry, was somebody about to say something? If not, I can read off another question that we've received from Rocco Santuri, which has more to do kind of with the structure for CA teams when they are on the ground in embassies. So as a CA team chief, my embassy interactions have been varied in terms of how my team fits into the embassy task org. I've worked directly for the DAT, the Defense Attaché, but also for the Office of the ODC Chief, the Office of Defense Cooperation Chief, and in some cases, the Public Affairs Office of the Embassy. You see I'm spelling out all the acronyms. Does it make sense to standardize how civil affairs fits into an embassy in terms of an established billet and overall strategy, but while still maintaining operational flexibility to work with ad hoc groups within the embassy to respond to specific opportunities and events? So one way of thinking of this is maybe your own specific experience and how your embassy, experience was organized, the various kind of pros and cons of that. Okay, go ahead, Caitlin.
Sure. So I say this with a disclaimer that obviously I no longer am a civil servant at the State Department, no longer affiliated with CSO, but I can say from my own experience, whenever I went on these long-term TDYs, to Nigeria or South Sudan or Kenya, I was nested within the political section. And particularly in my experience in Kenya, I think it makes the most sense that if there were to be some sort of institutionalized relationship, that it be with the political section. That said, I can imagine many other sections that would benefit from some sort of a more institutionalized relationship.
Okay. Any other thoughts, Amelia or John? I mean, in some ways, Amelia's position was an innovation, I think, that was intended to kind of broaden the way that CA interacted in that particular context.
Mhm.
If you have anything you want to say on that. We're letting her ship.
Yeah, what was that?
No, it's just funny because you're the picture that shows up is like this fabulous picture of you on vacation or something. So you're going
Oh
from like.
my gosh, how embarrassing.
No, it's great.
So in terms of standardization, I think AFRICOM is very unique in how it's structured. So I think that is why the position I had was fairly unique as well. But when it was originally brought to light and they began negotiations for it, the intent was for a civil affairs officer, 04 actually, to sit with the USAID regional mission, and conversely, USAID or OTI would have one of their guys sit up in Stuttgart with the SOJ 39, so that we could on either end facilitate information sharing. So that was definitely more geared toward development, not so much diplomacy and the embassy. However, I do know that some of the team leaders throughout the region did serve as SOFLI's Special Operation Forces Liaison Element, I believe. So they were jointly serving as a team leader and also working into the embassy as well. That's not standard either. I think standardization in terms of what the question is asking would be difficult to achieve because of how varied different countries and the size of the embassy in those countries are set up. That's all I've got.
Oops, thank you. I was so excited I like threw my computer aside. I agree with you. I think that actually is probably, it's less about how civil affairs is kind of treated or, than it is just how different our platforms look from country to country. And an example is, when Caitlin was out in Kenya, it was both our regional hub and our bilateral hub. That's sort of true for where Amelia was too, because our regional program at USAID is located in the same building as our bilateral aid program to Ghana, but it's a separate organization from that. And therefore, you don't report to an ambassador. You actually had 12 to 14 different ambassadors, whose missions you were supporting in that regional context. And so, obviously our posture in a place like Colombia or, India or someplace where we would have a massive presence is going to be different than South Sudan or Somalia, And so I think it's hard to standardize like where to drop CA in that kind of environment. Because the embassy itself is just so different that the organization is going to look different from one to the other. And I have to say USAID faces the same challenge, and we're usually joined at the hip with State Department. But in some places we have only one person. We have an office, which is less than a mission, and then we have a mission. So so it gets very complicated, and it's not only CA that sort of has to have a bespoke kind of response to an embassy situation. I see that Michael is up on the screen, ready to go, and he's my former boss, so I'm going to turn everything over to Michael now.
Thank you, Ryan. It's great to see you, and you guys are doing an outstanding job. I had a question / comment. I heard a SIMC team lead, civil military support element team lead talk at a conference, and he said his primary job as the SIMC head was to gather intelligence from local NGOs and international NGOs, USAID implementing partners, and pass it on to his special operations teams. Almost had a coronary when I heard that. Talked to him afterwards. He adhered to that theory. Made me think about what Caitlin and Amelia have been talking about. We need to institutionalize the training and the coordination before these teams go out, because there's nothing that's worse than taking information that we get from our implementing partners and turning it into an intelligence gathering thing. And to publicly say that is going to just erode trust, and it's been built over years. So the question is, how can we I think we need to institutionalize this in the course. I don't know if they talk about that, Amelia, now in the CA qualification course. But it's a critical, sometimes it happens accidentally. When I was in Kosovo, information we got, if we put it in the NATO system, everything in the NATO system was classified, no matter what it was. So it automatically, and we had NGOs who got really upset when their information ended up being classified, purely accidental. But we have to be sensitive to that, and we need to train our civil affairs officers, and a SIMC team lead should definitely not be going around saying that. I mean, information is critical. Intelligence is something totally different. So your views on how we institutionalize this within DoD.
So I think that's a great point, and it really drives home how complex in the situations that we find ourselves in can be. Notoriously, DoD overclassifies things. They gain information and suddenly it's secret. But I agree with you that probably the team leader didn't use the best choice of words, and maybe definitely the actions cast some shade on his activities. I will say that in my experience in the course, I don't know if they had so many similar incidences happen, but they really did drive home the difference between intelligence and information. And they did really try to, I guess, impart on us that, like, we're not intelligence collectors so much as gathering information, and what the intelligence community decides to do, excuse me, with that information is up to the intelligence agency. If that answered your question.
Yeah, I think that's great. Maybe if they put a little role-playing exercise in there when you're training up a SIMC about how you treat information, might not be a bad idea either. And Caitlin was talking about that too before they go out.
Yeah, if I can build on that slightly, I think one of the critical points there is for CA to know what type of information it should be getting in whatever environment. A SIMC is usually at a sort of phase 0 country, right? It's not in conflict. We're just there to help sort of influence and improve the American brand, so to speak. So the information we need in that environment is categorically different than information that we need in a country that we're trying to stabilize, say Somalia or Iraq or South Sudan, right? So I think it's important to maintain that distinction and critical that we on the CA side train to do that properly. And I think that's really difficult because there are some really fine nuances there that you won't necessarily get without being a professional humanitarian or a professional development practitioner. And I think that's an opportunity for us, again, on the interagency side to help CA up its professional game and increase its own influence within the interagency by sort of helping it establish greater credibility within the interagency.
Okay, I realize we're actually almost up to time, and John actually has to jump off at 14:30, so we'll need to do that as well. We want to also allow a little bit of time for the next panel to get itself organized. So I saw a final question from Chris Holshek asking about sort of how the interagency shares and tries to kind of, I guess, coordinate the different human terrain analysis that we get, whether it be market analysis in the sort of Madison Avenue kind of ways of doing things, or more sophisticated ways through the Global Engagement Center. Does anybody have any final thoughts on that you all want to share about? I think it kind of maybe gets back to our earlier question about doing assessments and how all three of those. I would just basically say, when I was at the Army War College serving as the USAID instructor there, you learn, and I was as a student, you learn about the dime, which is supposed to be the main elements of national power. Much is said and talked about in terms of diplomacy, military and economic elements of power, and I think it's only in the last 3 or 4 years that we've rediscovered the need to focus on information. when I was a student, it was about like, oh, but you know, Microsoft is American and Apple is American and Netflix is American, and that's information, you know, and that's power, but it's not really. And so I suggest that at least at the strategic level, we're still wrapping our arms around that. The Global Engagement Center is not necessarily where everybody turns to for leadership on that. I think that's fair to say. And we each have our own ways of doing that. But just final, you know, thoughts, if any, if you do have about how you share that kind of information beyond anything that we've already discussed today. And then we'll end the panel.
Well, I'll just put in a plug for my top line point. This does get back to that question of duplication and coordination. You know, State Department has tons of folks focusing on all these different elements of, you know, what Chris has called human terrain analysis. You know, better to coordinate with us and access the information and products we're putting out than try to do it on your own. And I think, you know, again, some can be greater than its parts.
Okay.
And I would just pile on that point as well, just recognizing that there are, you know, even as we do assessments within the USG to try to understand the environments in which, you know, we are currently working or intending on working, we need to look at, you know, what has already been done, what assessments exist out there. So as Chris mentioned, you know, what has the UN put out? What have NGOs in that region put out? What have civil society organizations in that region put out that can inform our own understanding, right? Just because, you know, the USG puts it out doesn't mean that it's, you know, authoritative. Are there other sources of information that we can be drawing on to build our understanding?
Any final thoughts, Amelia?
I think the other two nailed it on what they were saying about information sharing. Most of that, a lot of it's already out there, so it's just a matter of digging. And I think depending on the origin, maybe, of the civil affairs element, so like in the 83rd, for instance, we do most of our own data mining, but knowing where to look, and I think that's something that they do a pretty good job of in the course, and sharing different sources. So it's also just a function of experience and being on the ground and working with the interagency to know, I guess, reliable sources.
All right. Okay, well, I want to say thank you so much for the three of you. We're dead to him already, so he's already left. But thanks so much for our panelists. I really appreciate your insights and your stories. And in the interests of anybody who wants to sort of think about a little more about this, I just dropped into the chat box the link to the 1CA podcast interview with the acting administrator of USAID. To my knowledge, he is the only sub-cabinet level agency, I guess, head who is also previously a civil affairs soldier, and he loves to talk about his time in the civil affairs regiment and how it relates to his work leading my agency. One of the great things in my career has been discovering all of these civil affairs reservists and veterans and others who decided to join the bright side and are now working with USAID amongst all the unicorns and rainbows in our offices here and abroad. So thanks, everybody. Oh, yes, and Andrew Natsios was the CA officer, and so was Michael Hess, just FYI. All righty then. Great examples. All right, thanks, everybody, for your attention, and Caitlin and Amelia and John, wherever you are, really, really appreciate your taking the time to join us today. Over and out from us here. Thanks.
Thanks.